So let's get started. We'll get started by introducing ourselves. Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Leon Goldberg. I'm the host of Global Dispatches, this very podcast, and proud to be bringing you this episode live via Substack. And Dr. Farkas, why don't you introduce yourself as well?
Well, thank you so much, Mark, for the opportunity. I'm Evelyn Farkas. I'm the executive director of the McCain Institute, and very happy to be here to talk about all things foreign policy.
So, Evelyn, we are speaking at a moment of profound diplomatic fury around Ukraine. Before we speak about what is happening on the diplomatic front, can I have you just set the context for listeners in terms of what's been happening on the ground in the battle in Ukraine? It's summer. Summer is fighting season historically in this conflict. What have the contours of the fighting on the ground looked like over the last several months?
Well, the Russians have been making advances, albeit gradually, on the ground against the Ukrainians. They have been essentially flooding the zone with drones and, of course, manpower, both of which they have in greater abundance, unfortunately, than the Ukrainians. And so they've managed to push the Ukrainians back. As I said, incrementally. There's no radical change of the battlefield. They haven't captured anything operationally significant and certainly not strategically significant, but it's enough so that the Russian president, the Russian government thinks that they have some sort of momentum or at least time on their side.
I mean, do you think they do?
I don't, because I think both sides are tired. Both sides are looking for some kind of breakthrough. I think we're really in more of a stalemate still, despite these more recent advances that the Russians have enjoyed. The Ukrainians will always come up with some technological way to defend themselves. And they also often will pull a rabbit out of a hat. They'll surprise us with some kind of stunning operation that usually has operational and strategic value, unlike the Russian moves. So I think that, frankly, we're in a stalemate. And that includes, of course, the economic situation on both sides, and the diplomatic one is dynamic right now.
Yeah, no, well, I do want to get to the diplomatic front because things, have changed or are changing. But this kind of enduring stalemate just seems to be the like as it has been for the last 2.5 years now. As you noted, it seems that like the new innovations on the battlefield are these like drone swarms that Russia has been sending at pace against Ukraine, and of course, you kind of obliquely referenced Ukraine's spectacular Operation Spiderweb, in which they kind of penetrated deep into Russian territory using like innovative and surprising tactics. But generally speaking, the contours of this conflict really haven't changed much.
That's right. Yeah. And the reason is because, the Ukrainians only have so much manpower. They've got to man a very long front. And frankly, technologically, both sides have learned how to hold the other at bay. So no one has the upper hand technologically at the moment either. These things are dynamic, so I would expect them to shift. The other thing that's going on, in terms of the calendar is it's the summer, and this is when, both either side would be expected to try to take the offensive. And because the Russians have somewhat of a slight military advantage, they are taking they're trying to press this advantage and take an offensive. But as I said, it's not going spectacularly well. It's not achieving big results for them at this point.
So we are speaking on Friday, August 8th, and there have been a number of reports in recent days, even frankly in recent hours, about a potential meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Location and exact date TBD at this moment. Um, and this potential meeting was preceded by, Trump's de facto national security advisor, Steve Witkoff, visiting Moscow earlier. Can you just kind of set that diplomatic context as well? What do we know about that Witkoff trip? And, what do we know as of, 2 p.m. Eastern time about what this Trump-Putin meeting may look like?
Yeah, I mean, what happened was President Trump basically got increasingly impatient with the Russian government, with Vladimir Putin. So he started essentially setting ultimatums. And the first one, I think, was like 90 days. They kept getting shorter. And finally, he said, okay, the deadline for Russia taking action to cease firing against Ukraine and to come to the negotiating table in earnest is today, August 8th. And the Russian government essentially has responded to each one of his ultimatums by pummeling, just increasing the velocity of the amount of firepower that they are directing at the civilians in Ukraine, and particularly in the major cities like Kyiv, etc. So the Russian government did not do what our government was asking. Now it appears that because President Trump also, included in the ultimatum this prospect of sanctions, and he appeared to be quite serious about it in how he was dealing with India in particular, because the sanctions, of course, include sectoral sanctions.
Mhm.
Secondary sectoral sanctions. So anyone who buys oil from Russia will be sanctioned. And
And you're
I
referring to
think he
what
added.
just happened. Trump just imposed new tariffs on India for the fact that India was buying volumes of Russian oil.
Right. So it appears that he's put those tariffs on. Honestly, Mark, I'm a little unclear, what tariffs are on and what tariffs are off and what's declaratory and what's actually action. So
You and the
he
rest of the
said that
world.
he's going to.
Yeah.
Right. He's going to put these tariffs on India. Now, it did appear that he was going to keep the tariff pressure on until Putin did something in exchange. Putin then, clearly he can't. I mean, his economy is weak. He cannot. Secondary sanctions, if they're enforced, and, India and China don't buy oil from Russia, that would be a catastrophe for them financially. So, President Putin did what he could to delay, because he doesn't want a deal right now. He wants to let them keep fighting on the ground to try to get as much territory as possible. So to delay, he said, oh, sure, I'll have a meeting. Now, President Trump hoped initially the meeting would include, of course, President Zelensky, the Ukrainian leader, as well. The Russians are adamantly opposed to that. That is not going to happen. I can tell you that right now. And I have a big question in my head as to whether President Trump, our president, is actually going to be able to meet with President Putin in the near future. Yes, they're discussing this meeting today, but there are a lot of obstacles. First of all, where would they meet? There's an ICC, an International Criminal Court warrant out for Putin's arrest because of the hundreds of Ukrainian children that he kidnapped and is holding hostage, essentially, in Russia. That means that any government that has signed up to that court, so UAE, you name it, all of the Hungary, etc., they would have to arrest Vladimir Putin upon his arrival in their country. So that makes it tricky. On top of that is the reality that I don't think our president is going to get anything concrete, get any concessions from Russia in that meeting. So it's a highly risky endeavor, I would imagine, for President Trump, just because the critics will immediately see that he's not received anything in exchange. There may be something I don't know behind the scenes, but I don't see Vladimir Putin as being ready to make any real serious deal that the Ukrainians can accept.
I mean, there has been some reporting this morning from Bloomberg suggesting that the deal on the table, as it were, would be to essentially freeze the battle lines in exchange for some sort of cessation of hostilities, meaning, of course, that Russia would, have acquired territory through conquering parts of Ukraine, but at least that would stop the ongoing killing. Do you, and at least to me, to the extent that there ever has been a potential for a diplomatic or negotiated solution to the conflict, that was probably going to be it. Do you see that um, as potentially an outcome of this meeting?
Possibly only because President Zelensky and the Prime Minister of Poland also made some comments about possible ceasefire. And we know that President Trump and the White House have also been in touch with, at least with Ukraine, if not with some of our European allies. So it is possible that Putin will go and say, I'll do a ceasefire. But a ceasefire also is not a real concession. Now, I will admit that, President Trump and the Ukrainians will be happy to have killing stop, but it's still not going to be a solution to the problem. It still could end up being Vladimir Putin simply stalling for time. Maybe it's worth it, and I would imagine if the Ukrainian government has signed up to that idea, and they had in the past, but the thing was that the Ukrainian government said it has to be a more durable ceasefire and a real ceasefire. So those I guess will be the real, questions. The devil, of course, will be, as they say, in the details.
Mhm. Um, from Ukraine's perspective, what do you suppose would be the details that would make this a more attractive offer?
Well, if it's a durable ceasefire, that involves obviously cessation of attacks on the civilians, a freeze on the line of military warfare, and then the Russians really being willing to negotiate a security guarantee for Ukraine. Because right now, I think it's safe to say that the Ukrainian government would be willing to at least the term that we use is de facto. So, not in law, not de jure, but de facto, in reality, kind of cede territory to Russia, TBD, for a time into history, right? But not officially necessarily on all the maps. But let's say they let Russia hold on to some of the territory. That is something that a lot of us experts can envision as part of a deal. But the other side of it, Ukraine will not accept giving up some, even for temporarily, but into the future, some sovereignty over their territory, some control over their territory, if they do not get a guarantee that Russia will not reinvade and will not try to take more territory. It's just untenable for them. They don't want to go to war again. They've said it going back through history. This has been centuries of Russia invading. We need to put an end to it now.
Yeah, one concern I would imagine from Ukraine's perspective would be that, if a ceasefire happens, and I think it's, obviously far from certain that anything like that would happen, but if there is a ceasefire, it would just give Russia time to regroup. So what would that security guarantee look like? Because you have said, you have people like JD Vance, here in the United States who, are adamantly not willing to, confer that kind of security guarantee on Ukraine. So what would a viable security guarantee from Ukraine look like? It's not going to be, a promise from Vladimir Putin. What would it look like?
Well, it has to be coming from us, and that's the sticky part. President Trump needs to be either willing to push for Ukraine to join NATO. And I believe our allies would just line up behind the United States. It's usually how it works anyway. And certainly under President Trump, that's how it would work. Second option would be that President Trump says, I will go to the Senate and ask for a bilateral security guarantee from the United States. But either way, the Ukrainians are not going to accept a guarantee that doesn't include the United States. So then the third option, of course, is kind of an ad hoc, it's not NATO, but it's NATO member countries. And perhaps Putin could be forced to accept that. And then the United States would still be in the mix.
So you have your eyes closer to the kind of domestic politics, I would say, than I do. But it would seem to me that, from all we're hearing from the White House, that option of going to the Senate and getting some sort of bilateral security guarantee doesn't seem to be, terribly likely. Because you do have like voices within this administration, prominent voices, and Trump seems very easily swayable, just given his vacillations on Ukraine thus far. It would seem that that aspect of it, the American security guarantee, just ain't going to happen in this current administration.
I wouldn't rule it out. I spent almost a decade
Oh
on the
yeah.
Senate Armed Services Committee, senior staff there. There is deep bipartisan support in the Senate for Ukraine. And though there are a few members who would object, they would get the two-thirds, I believe, in order to give that guarantee, especially if President Trump made this a priority. And yes, you're right, he'd have to overrule the more isolationist elements of his team. But if he decided to do it, I have no doubt the Senate would do it.
So I guess in the coming, days as the situation evolves, what are you looking at? Like, what are you looking at from Russia's side, from Ukraine's side, and from the American side?
Well, first of all, obviously, I'm really curious whether President Trump would take the risk of meeting with Putin, given that he's not predictable, Putin, and Putin is not going to telegraph, his next moves to our president. So I'm a little bit skeptical. And President Trump has a lot on his plate, and he has another foreign visit coming up within weeks, I guess, to the United Kingdom. Um, so I guess I'll be waiting to see what happens there. And then really what is Putin doing in terms of action, because that's really more telling. What is he doing on the battlefield, and what is happening economically? What are his people saying? And then finally, I would say the most important thing is the United States continuing to apply pressure on Putin, because the best hope for President Trump to make this meeting, if it happens, a success, is to keep putting hard pressure on Putin. That includes obviously sanctions and sanctions enforcement. That includes putting military pressure by providing Ukraine with more weapons and more protection. And that includes, of course, diplomatic pressure. So if our government continues that pressure, maybe something, I mean, something will result eventually. Perhaps something could result in the short term.
Yeah, I mean, on that question of pressure, I mean, do you draw like a straight line between the imposition of secondary sanctions on, or tariffs, I should say, on India for purchasing Russian oil, and a seeming like willingness of Putin to want to talk?
Yes, yes, I do. Because Putin understands he's got to manage this relationship. So he's trying to, basically stave off any further harm to his economy and continue to keep Trump, on his side or not taking any other action. If he can get a meeting, then up until the time of that meeting, he can guess, although again, President Trump is not predictable. So he would imagine that President Trump wouldn't do anything further, to do anything to jeopardize a meeting that he's agreed to, he being President Trump. So for President Putin, that's buying time. But there is a risk, because if he ramps up military action, for example, we've seen President Trump get angry at that. So I think a lot depends on whether Putin calculates correctly about our president.
Before I let you go, is there any other point you wanted to make? A question I didn't ask? I don't want to leave anything hanging.
No, I mean, I do think though that President Trump has a lot of cards, up his sleeve to play here. And so it's important for him, to make sure that he's playing them at the right moment, at the moment when Russia is weakest. So it may be premature to play these cards, although I understand the desire to, get to peace quickly.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Evelyn Farkas. I really appreciate chatting with you as always. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for the opportunity. Take care.